Hello YouTube. Well, today I'm in Petersburg, Virginia. It's about 25 miles south of Richmond, and during the Civil War a very long battle happened here. Gonna get into a lot of different aspects of this. My family, my mother's side, comes from this area. And I think I mentioned my great-great-grandfather up in Gettysburg, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him as we go. But right now I'm standing in battery number 5. It was a part of the Dimmock line that around the city of Petersburg. It was 10 miles of defenses. It was built in 1862. And that in 1864, in June, early June, Grant, having fought a series of battles trying to take Richmond, which is, like I said, 25 miles north of here, he tried, and Lee blocked them all along the way. Some decisive victories, some not. For the Confederacy, but Grant decided that the way, if he couldn't take Richmond, the best way to do was to stop the supplies going in. There were 5 railroads that came through Petersburg. This was a nexus of transportation in the area, and if he could cut this off, he could cut off the supplies to Richmond. Lee didn't think that that Grant holding back was actually headed this way. So when the Union forces first got here, they vastly outnumbered the Confederates protecting the city under Beauregard, and the first onslaught of the Federal troops overran this position and took about 1.5 miles of the 10 miles of defenses around the city. So during the rest of this area was more than 1 mile behind the lines, behind the Union lines. So let's, I'm going to move on to the next spot, and show you one of the major artillery pieces used at this battle. Well, a lot of this battle, or some people call it a siege, and I'll explain the difference in a bit, was artillery. This went on for 9 months, 292 days, I believe. And this is what's known as the Dictator. It's a 13-inch mortar. The barrel thickness is a little over 1 foot, and it's probably only about 4 feet from front to back. This one is called the Dictator. It would throw a 225-pound shell up to 2 miles. And in the 3 months that they used it, they fired 218 rounds. Buried in the hill over here is they had the powder magazine, so the powder was protected from Confederate artillery coming in. But those 218 rounds from here thrown into the city were not really effective. They did do some damage, but people got used to this. The mortars coming in, they could see the shells coming through the air, and it sort of was a spectator sport, although somewhat dangerous. So now the Dictator is located just down the hill from Battery 5. So it was, again, about 1 mile behind the Confederate lines. And on June 15th to the 18th, well actually the attack started on the 15th, when the troops, Union troops, overran Battery 5, they paused. And has all through the Civil War, the Union troops paused, and that seemed to be a mistake they could never quite remedy. It gave Lee time to get his troops here on June 18th, it's 1864, and that's set the stage for the 9 months of battle. Now here at Battery 8, between 5 and 11 was the stretch that was captured. Now this particular area, General Smith put on his left flank the U.S. colored troops. These African Americans, about 3,700 of them. The white commanders did not think that they would be much use, that they would fight. You know, all those old bad stereotypes. They came through here and pushed back. The Confederates took this area, and when they sent some white troops in to get to Battery 9, I believe it was, and found out that the African American troops had already taken it, they moved on, and again, like I said, captured all the way to 11. A lot of the earthworks, like here at 8 and at 5, we see the earthworks are still here. A lot of the other ones aren't, and people wonder why. They think maybe, you know, it was a effort to erase history, or the local farmers cleared them to make it easier for agriculture. That's not the case. The Union troops destroyed them so that with picks and shovels, and to ensure that if the Confederates were to retake the positions, they would not have these earthworks on the battery positions. So you get a better idea of what those earthworks and defenses look like. Remember, this is 10 miles of this, and imagine running up against this, sharpened spikes, and I'm sure they weren't flat as much as this. They're more pointy, followed by a ditch with those earthworks. The inside of the earthworks would have been similar to this. Logs, sandbags, sandbags up on top, force for firing, and mortars, not as big as the Dictator, but they didn't have to go as far. And this is flooded. But I'm standing next to this, looking out, and Yankees coming from that general direction. The city behind me, and another spot for another artillery piece here in this corner. So not all of the line would have been like this. This is more of what would be termed a fort. And let's see if I can get over here without getting too wet. But behind it would have been, we had a massive amount of rain yesterday. So would have been things like this little cabin. Because this is Northern Virginia, it does get cold. And you could take, if you didn't have the logs, you could take sticks and vines and twigs and weave this. If you filled these up with soil and had them closely put together, they would protect you from the enemy bullets. But the this little soldier's hut, this is a model of what they could have had. I don't know how much you can see, a little fireplace and a couple of beds, and that's about it. I mean, the doorway's only a little over 4 feet high. But they had thousands of these huts all over, you know, big army. So, this is one of the positions that was overrun that day, June 15th. And with the African American troops, as I said, the official designation was U.S. colored troops at the time, but they distinguished themselves quite well here and earned the respect of a lot of the white troops. So to get an idea of where things stood, this is where we started out, Battery 5, and we stopped at Battery 9. We are now along the banks of Harrison's Creek, and the Confederates fell back there on June 15th up on the heights over here, and overnight they constructed fortifications that would withstand the Yankee attacks, 2 attacks on the 16th and the 17th. It helped that they did get some reinforcements and got their numbers up to 14,000. By the end of the day on the 16th, the federal troops numbered 50,000. So what's that, 3 to 1? Maybe a little more than that. But they were able to hold back here for those 2 more days. By the 18th, Lee's army was here, and they fell back from that position another half-mile west. We'll get up there. This creek actually was also in a year later, March 25th, 1865, was as far as Lee's troops made it on his final assault on the federal troops trying to break through. You can hear a train that is on where one of the lines was coming into Petersburg, and that was the major reason for being here. But right now, this is that ditch and the earthworks around was called Fort Stedman. And on March 25th, 1865, Lee sent his men against this under Gordon. And you know, it's a proper fort facing in every direction. I got some nice pictures to get an idea of what the interior of this fort looked like at the time. So this depression in the middle probably was this log covered structure, which I'm guessing was probably a powder magazine. And they had, let's see, the Confederate line was only 300 yards away from this when this was occupied by the Union. And under cover of darkness, Lee's troops advanced, and when the attack began, they overran this and pushed that way. down where the Cushman Creek, or the creek, Stedman, no, whatever, the creek, that's where it faltered and they were pushed back, and a lot of the Confederates took shelter inside this fort to fight back, and over 100 were killed in here. Now during that Union attack, some of the more seasoned soldiers who knew how strong and how hard it would be to get in here actually refused to obey orders to attack. But there was an artillery unit that was well regarded as having been guarding around Washington, D.C., and they were derisively known as tin box soldiers. They really did not have any battle experience, and they attacked here, and the Confederates were fighting for their lives, and they well, they all were, but they were able to hold them off for quite a bit before they were also overrun. But this was the last time that Lee tried to break out and push back around Petersburg. So Fort Stedman is other side of those trees, and when the Confederates attacked and were able to overrun Stedman, they also when the Union went after them, Gordon's troops counterattacked and were beaten back. The day's survivors came back into what is Fort Haskell, which is here, and they were under murderous cannon fire from Stedman, and the Confederates tried to take this fort too. And to do that, they had to cross through that ravine. Well, the Union troops in here, the hurt and the wounded, the sick, they were loading the rifles, and the able-bodied soldiers were firing down into that ravine, and very few Confederates were able to make it out of that ravine, much less survive the wounds that they suffered there. And to get an idea of what and again, you remember how these earthworks are eroded. They would have been much flatter than we see now, but I don't want to climb up on them, but let me see if I can get an idea here. So this is what they're looking. You imagine crossing that field over there, and if you remember, if you saw my video about Gettysburg, the sharpshooters, and we're talking 1865, a lot of these troops were seasoned. They knew how to handle a rifle. Sharpshooters could shoot 1,000 yards, and that's way less than that. Oh, I'm standing in a cellar hole of what would have been or was a house back during the battle, and that would have been level of the first floor. And the basement, my guess is because it's got this double chimney and fireplaces upper and lower, that this would have been utilized, I'm sure, as a place for commanders and this particular spot, I mean, the upper story probably would have been a really dangerous place to be, because at this point and all along through here, the lines were only a couple hundred yards apart, and this higher ground here would have given us a view of the aftermath of what to me is one of the most dramatic parts of this battle, and we'll get to that. But I thought I'd take this moment to explain why I think of it as a battle, not a siege. A lot of the signs around here all call it the siege. This went on for 9 months. Okay, so you think, siege. Well, by definition, a siege is where you cut off all communication with the outside, and that never happened. Well, not till the end. Lee was never totally surrounded. They were able to keep access to most of those railroad lines. They said there was 5 that came in here, and the 5th one actually was not taken and controlled by the Union until late March of 1865. Again, this went on for 292 or something like that days. So it really wasn't a siege, but it was an ongoing series of skirmishes lumped together as a battle. But Grant's big strategy was he was trying to take the Confederate capital of Richmond. Again, it's only 25 miles away. So what he did, he had enough forces, especially when Sheridan's army joined up with him. He had the Army of the Potomac. There was another army on the Union side. But what they would do is attack fortifications around Richmond, and that would draw more of Lee's troops that way, and simultaneously start an attack here. So Lee, vastly outnumbered, had to try to defend 2 different cities. And again, Richmond, capital, and Petersburg, because that supplied the capital. Well, that's why I call it a battle, not a siege. Siege would have been like Vicksburg on the Mississippi, totally surrounded. Someday I'll get there. And they were totally cut off. And that's a whole another ball of wax. So let me move along here and let's get to what I think is the most dramatic part of this whole battle. So there is that house we were just at. Again, high ground, Union lines, or Union fort. Where I'm standing is where the Union picket line, or the most forward trenches were, and where those people are is where the Confederates were. So this is where things stood in and around June 18th, and shortly after, 1864. And a commander from Pennsylvania, who was a mining engineer, came up with the idea of mining underneath the Confederate lines, creating a gallery, big open area, and packing it full of explosives. The idea was to blow a hole in the Confederate lines and be able to open a breach and be able to push through those lines. So a week after that all started, so June 25th, 1864, he was given the okay, I'm sorry about the sun, he was given the okay to start the digging. And some of the commanders were a little skeptical that this was going to work, but they gave him the go-ahead. And let me get down here and we can see where they started. What's sort of cool is I remember as a kid coming by here and not being able to see this aspect. We took a guess, and so that's where they started the tunnel up those hills. This is out of sight down in this little ravine. They were able to come up through the ravine behind us and dig secretly to head underneath the lines. Of course, they wanted to be quiet, so they took very slow. And again, this started on June the 25th. So let's get up to the other end of where that tunnel went. So this tunnel ended up being over 500 feet long. And how do you ensure ventilation through this? Beginning is right down there. We're about 100 feet in, and this depression is actually where they dug a vertical shaft, still out of sight of the Confederate lines up there. Dug a vertical shaft. They put a canvas partition across the opening down at the beginning, and they would have a fire going here. They had a wooden box or conduit, you know, whatever, a wooden tube that went through that canvas. So the fire here would draw air out of the mine, and by pulling hot air out, it was sucking air in through that wooden box, and they just kept extending that out, so it would pull, like I said, pull the stale air out of here, and thereby ensuring fresh air flowing up to the guys that were mining. I'm sure fire is going all around. Who's going to notice that the one more plume of smoke? And when I said the Union picket line, this is the front line right here. So we're a little over 100 feet in from where they started when they went underneath their own lines and headed this way. So at 4:40 a.m., July 30th, 1864. So we're talking 5 weeks after they started digging the tunnel, they came here under the Confederate lines. And that's on that moment they set off the explosion. And this is the resulting crater. When they got the tunnel here, they went off in two, like a Y magazine. When this went off, it created a hole 170 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. 278 Confederates died in the blast, and two 1,700-pound cannons were completely thrown out of the area. Now the Union, getting ready for this, moved up troops in covered walkways, which basically deep enough trenches that they couldn't be seen from here. Moved them up close to the front lines. And here's another thing where, again, gallery, big crater. The Union sent their troops in, and rather than go around either side where a lot of the defenders were dazed, and again, almost 300 Confederates were dead, instead of going around, they rushed right into the gap and into the crater. And if you can see how the backside was pretty steep, Confederates rushed in reinforcements, and it basically became like shooting fish in a barrel. Shooting down in there. A lot of the troops that were involved in that were some of the USCT, the African American troops, and as they came in, they were yelling "No quarter," and that's pretty much what the Confederates did. They took that and went with it. Any of the African American troops that were captured were killed, just killed outright. They weren't kept as prisoners. And like I said, this to me is the most dramatic part of that. Again, we're only 6 weeks into this, and this was a major problem. Again, over there in that green mode area, that's where we were, and they could see what was going on here. And it was let's see, 800 Virginians recaptured the trenches here just north of the crater. And so again, this is probably the most dramatic thing, this depiction of the fight going on. Yankees, obviously the Confederates. And all of that, like I said, started with the explosion at 4:40 a.m. and by mid-afternoon, this was all back in Confederate hands. And that was pretty much the beginning of it, of the Battle of Petersburg. It settled into more or less a stalemate. Lee trying to protect the supply routes into Petersburg, and Grant trying to capture them and capture the city of Richmond, the capital. So you can see why I say that's the most dramatic aspect, but it also has some relevance to the future from that time. 55 years later, the U.S. was involved in World War I, and during that war, it became a lot of trench warfare, which is a lot of what was going on here with and again, they're 200-300 yards apart. Same thing during World War I. And if you look into it, this idea of mining underneath troops under opposing forces and blowing them up was a large part in many areas during World War I. And in that, I mean, the Confederates tried here, they heard people tunneling and set off an explosion hoping to collapse the tunnel. And in World War I, a lot of that happened. If you do a search on YouTube, I've been watching a few videos about it, and it's quite interesting of how what was learned here in 1864 was applied 55 years later in World War I. So here in the battlefield, you can see a series of trenches, and they stretch out quite a ways. These are not from the Battle of Petersburg. These are actually trenches that were dug as training for the soldiers of World War I. So the British instructors came over and instructed them on the construction of trenches, because you know, as World War I, a lot of trench warfare. Well, that pretty much concludes my tour of the battlefield here at Petersburg. As usual, there is way more than I covered in this. I only covered the one part of it, not all the stuff that went on downtown and the other fronts. But there is an app if you're interested. It's really good. A lot of the information I shared with you came from the app and other readings that I've done. Just look for Petersburg Battlefield app, and it'll give you a lot more information. And actually, it's the first national park I've found that actually had an app. And this one's, again, is really good. I promised to talk about my great-grandfather, my actual family history with this battle. I did mention up in Gettysburg that he was with Lee's army. I obviously did not agree with what he was fighting for back then, but again, it's family history and it's what we got. This battle concluded March 25th, 1865, 290 something days after it started. Lee, when Grant took the last of the 5 railroad lines going in, Lee decided that it was inevitable, and told the Confederate government that they needed to evacuate Richmond and Petersburg, and he and his troops quietly slipped away. 1 week later, him and Grant met up again at Appomattox. At that point, after all of this, Lee's army was suffering from starvation and dysentery. And if you look back at my video about Appomattox, I go into a lot of detail on that one. The Union captured his supply train, and he couldn't feed his troops, and decided that that was the end. My great-great-grandfather, on that retreat, they went right by his farm. So he was suffering from dysentery again, starving, going by the farm, decided, you know, like, hey guys, I'm gonna stop, see the wife, and yoink. The way my southern relatives tell it is that the family, when all this started and came close, they killed the family cow, buried it out in the swamp so the Yankees wouldn't get it, and they would go out and dig up chunks of meat. Again, that meat must have been going pretty bad by the end, but they keep it away from the Yankees. Now, great-great-grandpa was sick. Like I said, he did have dysentery, and they hid him under the floorboards, because of course the Yankees were checking every structure along the way, looking for food, looking for Confederate deserters, whatever. And so they hid him under the floorboards. The only doctors that they could find were Yankee doctors. So eventually they dressed him up in Grandma's nightgown, cap, got a Yankee doctor in to check him out, gave him whatever medication they had for dysentery back in the 1800s. And again, this is like literally the end. I'm not, they never really said whether this was after the surrender, but Yankee doctor did not make mention of grandma's 3 weeks of beard. So that's my family's personal connection with the Civil War, at least on my mom's side. I'm still digging into my dad's side. So anyway, I'll leave you with that, and we'll get on the road and see what else I can find. See you later, YouTube.
Jumped off the wagon and he spread out his hands. Brace yourselves and come for your women. We will do what